marks that I award tonight are marks for an image compared to other images in tonight's competition. Not what it might get in the LMCPU, not what it got in the previous competition, but what it gets tonight according to the competitors. So mother and children, sorry. I enjoy the more viewpoint that you've achieved. There is some super lighting on the gills of this particular specimen. Sufficient idea of location to give me a clue that it is in the woodland rather than on a single tree somewhere. So you've got a lot of work going for you. And I do enjoy the fact that on the diagonal that you've chosen on this near a tree trunk, we've got a little bit of interest up and bottom as we come through. So it retains your interest. And so on that one, we'll start with 17 marks.
Peter Kay.
Well, you've got to make the most of that because you might not get any more. if you feel that your compatriots are not responding quick enough, start the applause yourself. You know, it might catch on. Fungus moon. Right. It is a very, very formal. Stand up and look down at your feet to see the specimen. I have got no idea really of size from your photograph. I have got no idea on how high this particular item is. The lighting hasn't been helpful because the lighting gives a blanket lighting. There is no highlights and shadows. Bit of side lighting is wanted. And I accept that there are occasions when it's difficult to get any additional lighting. You can't get down low enough if you're anything like me. Well, I can get down, I can't get well back up again afterwards. But a second flash gun you won't have. But somewhere you've got to have either a handkerchief or something pale, piece of tissue, anything at all, just held off camera, just outside the viewfinder, just to give a little bit of contour, a little bit of light and shade to the subject. I think we've done a remarkable job. But on this one, no 3D effect, so 13 marks. And as you'll see, I don't go into this 3-tier judging scoring that many people do. If it's mediocre, it's 17. If it's reasonable, it's 18. And if it's very good, it's either 19 or 20. I'm trying to do a rating mark. So 3 small shrooms. Again, I envy you because you've done a low viewpoint. So you are either very agile or, like me, you take a companion with you that says, when I'm finished taking your photographs, pull me up, Fred, and Fred pulls me up. So you've got the low viewpoint, which I do like. We haven't quite managed to get sufficiently low to get all the gills, but there is an inference of gills, certainly on the top right one. I also enjoy the fact that you're not the first person to look at the mushrooms because the sign has been there before you and left a little bit of web. So another little attraction. And again, the base that you've chosen is not straight across the base of the image. So we're working hard on that one, and 3 small shrooms get 17 marks.
Colin Yates.
Velvet child. Again, we managed to get lower than the species and the specimen, so that's working for us. We can actually see the gills as we climb up the column towards the top. We can see the other side, so that's where half of the image, or half of the information is about the mushroom. We've got a little choice of left and right. We've got the blue side and the green side, so it's almost like one of these football matches interest. You can have the blue bit and the green bit. The one thing that disappoints, because of the overhead lighting on this one, again, it's blanket lighting, so there isn't a great deal of texture reproduced to the viewer. So I feel as though it's not quite giving me as much information as I honestly believe it should. And on that one, therefore, 14 marks. These fascinate me. I said I like the story. It's got a lovely story. I don't know where it's coming from. It's going because it's creeping ever nearer to this left-hand edge. So it isn't just static fungus. It actually gives me the feeling that it's a living creature trying to walk along and finding more food. So I do enjoy the crust. On this one, we've got some nice rim lighting on the specimens, so that works very well. I've got to be very, very careful because I realised last week when we had a judge at our own club, he waved in front quite happily of the screen and pointed things out all over the screen, and the people on Zoom hadn't got a clue. So I've got to be very careful, and I will use my little spot as little as I possibly can. But I enjoy this one. I enjoy the fact that there are a separation of foreground and background. So we've got them on this on the edge, literally the edge of the world as far as they're concerned. 17 marks.
Kirsty Railton.
Bluebells. Having travelled up to Rannerdale quite a few years running to see the bluebells coming out up there. I applaud your ability to photograph them. I think the first 2 or 3 attempts that I did, bluebells are notorious for not reproducing. Certainly in the old film, they always had a pink cast to them. We had Heather Angel once upon a time, and she said, I said, how do you get your bluebells blue? She said, I put a blue filter on. Bright idea. On this one, it's just a little bit too confused. I'm a simple soul, and I like my pictures to be understood quite readily, quite quickly. And on this one, there's just a little bit too many items to look at. We've got one bloom facing towards the photographer, but others are getting in the way. Highlights on some of the other petals are stronger than on this forward-looking blue. So 15 marks. I do enjoy the stop you put on the right hand.
Bernard Barmond.
This shouldn't do anything. It's ferns. It's all green. We've got little bits of turning into autumn where the brown is coming through. So I think the photographer has been very much aware of his surroundings, but also aware of the light that's coming through. I must comment on sort of blanket lighting on some of the images we've seen so far. And on this one, we've got this lovely patchy lighting. And as long as the photographer can make use of that patchy lighting and make use of the dapples so that the dapples focus on what he wants us to look at, I think it's worked very, very well. And the Lakeland fern gets 18 marks.
He sits it out.
That's good. Different feel altogether to the previous one. Light, creative, very soft, very delicate. And I think that has the makings of an enjoyable photograph. There is some softening in the background, but I do like the fact that the background has some tones and different colours in it. Not sufficient to distract, but to show that it is a genuine outside photograph. So that works. And I also like the soft out of focus from bottom left corner, this looking at the leading up towards the little collection of flowers. 17 marks.
Ruth Lockery.
Giant saddle. I think John Wayne must have had one of these. It was why he always looked as though he was very bow-legged, you know. Frightened. But on this one, we've managed to get full detail recorded of the fung. Again, the spider's been there before, so we've got a little bit of added feature in the top left-hand corner. I would prefer there to have been a little bit less background detail on the right-hand half, because the tree virtually cuts it down the middle. And I'd just like to have concealed the fact that there is somewhere a straight edge at the bottom which says it isn't natural. It's the edge of a paving of a garden or something like that. And I would have liked to have had that softened off. Still not too late, and still do a clothing to get rid of that. But otherwise, I think you've done extremely well in 17 marks.
Alison Townley.
Beach daisies. One that I would believe would possibly do a lot better in other competitions. There is it grabs attention. You can't ignore it. I've seen lots of photographs where the photographer has got one leg slightly shorter than the other. But this is taking it to extreme, isn't it? You've got, you know, one leg cut off at the D to get so much of a slant on. So that fascinates me. I'm not too sure that I'm not certain what the photographer wants me to look at. I enjoy the top. I enjoy this striking diagonal from top left, that leading towards the fence post towards the right hand edge. Quite pleased with that. But I'm distracted from looking at the sky bit, from looking at the daisy bit. But every time I look at the daisy bit, I'm reminded that the sky above and these white railings just grab attention all the time. It's a little bit, what's saying it's a little bit messy because we've got a couple of flowers, one on the immediate left-hand edge. I don't think is doing anything at all, this half a flower. And I would prefer it was either a flower or no flower. And I would have cropped it in a little bit beyond that. Similarly, right at the base, there is one very, to me, dominant out of focus blue on towards the left-hand edge. And I think, again, I would have preferred to have taken that away because the rest of the daffodil, the rest of the flowers are quite reasonably short. But anything so big, so close towards the camera, tends to be a little bit of a distraction. So the beach branches get 15 marks.
Caroline Phillips.
I admit confusion. I do admit confusion. whilst it's quite nice to set fire to tinsel, I don't like sure what somebody wants to do. Why you tried to have gin and a bathtub, I'm not certain. So I'm struggling to try and find the story that the photographer is trying to teach me. I'm not certain what that story is. So I struggle hard. We'll have to have a talk afterwards. But quite decent lighting. We've got a reasonable separation from backdrop. We've got an acceptable base level. But I'm lost on my story. So 14 marks. That one was not owned by anybody. Did you notice? Nobody said that nobody put their name to that.
We only give names out over a certain mark.
Oysters in the wood. This is a delightful pair of photographs. I'm not bothered which half you look at. It's very acceptable in its own right. Perhaps the left image is the left half is slightly stronger than the right one, although the right one has got more contours showing because the lighting is a little bit more contrasting on that right hand side. But this space in the middle, I keep jumping from one to another. I feel like I'm at Wimbledon again, watching tennis going bong bong. And that is a pity because I think there is so much going for it that I think you've just been you've tried to encompass too much within the frame. So, but very well done. 16 marks technically.
Guys, really sorry to interrupt. I'm in the middle of something. We're going to be leaving now next door. So if you want a break and refreshments, how are you going to do that? Are you just going to go through and
Yeah.
yeah, would that be all right?
Yeah.
Sorry to disturb you.
Thank you. That's good. Thank you.
Kirsty Railton.
Still life with ferns. Using artwork of what perhaps could be a Victorian or early Edwardian publication is quite fine. Again, I'm not overly certain what message I should get from these. We have one fern stole. We have 3 blobs, but I'm not sure where they live within the story that you're telling me. So I struggle very, very hard with that one, I'm afraid. 14 marks. Rhododendron, different in field to a lot of the others so far. That will hold back if we may, please. Again, very ethereal, lovely and delicate inference of grasses coming in toward from the left-hand edge. It is a mood photograph, but I think I would like to see something just a little bit sharper within that area. Depth of field is quite shallow. We've got a couple of blooms looking towards us, but doesn't quite make me want to examine the tip of the orchid as much as I believe it should. 16 marks.
Ruth Lockery.
What's for the tracks? This is where you need that second person to help you, because when the bee is so close, I don't feel like as a photographer going any closer. My camera is a lovely barrier between me and any live specimen that happens to be camera range. But I think that the person that you took with you could literally just put the finger up one of the top two flowers and just pull it slightly sideways so that I can see just a little bit more into the trumpet of the flower, rather than see just the side. And there's interesting spots on those lower petals that make me do the same as the bees. It makes me want to go inside and have another look. I think that you need just a tiny little bit more help. I can't say go any lower, but it just needs just a little bit more information for one of those flowers. 17 marks.
Steve Weatherly,
Another one that's very different, very bright, catching all the light. That one will hold back, please. Every week at home, we have had for the last 12, 18 months, a family quiz night, where all the members of the family, wherever they happen to be in the UK, gather together. This is one that I would love to put in my quiz night to say, what on earth is it? I really would. I'm known to do strange sort of photographs from unusual angles, but it's fascinating. It's almost like a fishing peat net upside down that drops over the top of the stem. So I'm not sure what else to look at. It's got a good lead in from this right-hand edge. There is lovely toning in the background. I'm delighted on that. But I'm sorry, I am not certain what I'm looking at. So 13 marks. This one going very, very contrasting compared to the very delicate images that we've seen a little earlier. It fascinates me. No matter how many times I look at this, I keep seeing shellfish. I don't particularly enjoy shellfish. It just feels as though it's one of these, encrusted rocks that you see as the tide disappears from high tide. Again, I'm not quite certain what to look at. There is a gap between the two colonies. The right-hand colony climbing up the trees, okay. It comes towards this dead stalk. And there's a no entry sign there. And none of those on the right-hand side can come across to this left. So a lot of me goes up this little path between, comes to the stalk and says, so what am I doing here when I found the stalk? And I'm not overly certain. So it loses its impact, I think. Some of the highlights towards the top edge, the tree trunk second in from the right is just grabbing up attention a little bit. I think some toning down would have been worthwhile to soften that, and 13 marks. Lovelier. Now I said on some of the others that it reminded, isn't this an hunting tip? Well, to the right, wrong side, goes around, it's just there. So this, and as soon as I see things like that on the photograph, make me imagination just go silly. I find it very difficult to come back to what the photographer was trying to show. Until the buds are fully out into flowers, they lack a little bit of colour, which is evident on the furthest extent of the shoot on the right hand edge. I'm not overly keen on the white triangle out of focus on the bottom frame. And I'm a little bit disturbed with the leaf in the very top left. If you want to use that as the leading, then that leaf stops me being let in because it's so bright compared to the others. So not quite yet, and 13 marks. Down low. Yeah, all right, you can bend down, yeah. Tell me afterwards if you were able to get up. But again, I think with a lot of nature and natural history shots, you've got to get down to the same level as the plant. Otherwise, you are actually looking down on the plant. You're throwing it away as having no consequence. So if we can get to the same level, or slightly below, we raise the stature, the importance of the specimen we're photographing. Quite happy on this one. We've deliberately left a strong stopper on the left side with the brown stalk going up. On the right side, looking at the fungus itself, I think it's foxed us a little bit, because if I look very, very carefully right at the base of the photograph, it gives the impression that the focus of your camera was slightly in front of that fungus rather than on the fungus itself, because there seems to be greater sharpness at the base of the photograph. So I think the focus is throwing you a little bit on that one. I would have preferred to have done a tiny little bit of local manipulation, I won't call it fiddling, and just tone down a little bit that second fungus, but down low gets 14 marks. Spring's just around the corner. And if you want to know which corner, you look at the flower on the extreme right-hand side, and he said, it's that way. So there's the, or else he's sticking his tongue out at me, I'm not sure which. That's why I sat on this side instead of. Again, we've made use of a softening of the image to try and get emotion into the photograph. Lots of work being done on the flower heads, but apparently very little done on the base of the photograph, on the stems and stalks that are just about appearing. Because again, they are sharper than the flowers. That I'm happy that you don't do any work on them, but remove them. Give me either a single flower on which I can focus, or a group of flowers, but don't put the sharp bits where they shouldn't be. And spring gets 15 marks.
Full Calvert,
Indian tulip. This almost looked as though it was going to be an HDR, a relatively low resolution image that was pushed in processing to get plenty of contrasting, which has certainly succeeded. But again, I struggle a little bit to decide what to view. I've had some fun with some of these, as you can tell. On the extreme right, we've got the backside of one flower head. I'm not sure whether that's part of the group or it should have been removed. And similarly, on this left-hand side, where we've got quite a dark border, and then we've got 2 or 3 little blue patches, which again grabbed my attention. And I think we would have been quite happy to have cropped off this left-hand edge, so that it made it easier to concentrate the viewer's attention on the the arrangement in the center of the image. And Indian gets 13 marks. Shrooms in woods. We've got detail, we've got contours which I can accept. We've got a reasonable location. The one thing that would spoil you from doing a great deal better with this image in the competitions is you've got to write more effective specimens. And I think that Reader's Digest is some of these that want to show the great British countryside wouldn't be too happy at putting in 3, if you will, substandard specimens within their photograph. Within the photograph that you've provided, I don't think they play a particularly important part to say this is what happens when mushrooms start to decay and so on. So I'm just a little bit upset on the 14 marks. Rosemary will have heard something I enjoy trying to photograph. I think you've been more successful than I have. There is a disadvantage of rosemary. Will have heard that they're so flipping tall that if you're not careful, you've got to have a lot of background in order to get anything like the height of the plant. I think on this you worked quite well. We've managed to get sharpness throughout the first stem, but we're falling off quite happily in the background. 15 marks.
And the graph.
It's so comforting, it's so pleasant. But rather than that, we'll hold it back from there. We've gone from the sublime to the horrible, haven't we? All the nasty bits of the wood are beginning to appear on this one. That one will hold back also, please. Ryan's crocus, again using a very restricted depth of field to try and convey some mood to it. Even though it is entitled the Ryland crocuses, I think it should be entitled the brown leaf, because the brown leaf again is a little bit sharper, certainly on the top edge, than some of the specimens. So I think we've got to do very, very careful post-processing to try and soften that, and then the attention is taken up by the crocus. 14 marks. We've got wall, we've got hills, we've got all the rubbish on the floor of the woodland, and all the detritus on the floor acts as a good balance towards these funnels, as the photographer said. I wonder quite honestly and truthfully whether the third specimen right at the top edge adds anything to the composition. And I think I might have been inclined to have removed that or darkened it substantially so that the two at the front get all the attention. 16 marks.
Philip Almond.
That one will hold back, please. I must admit, when this came on screen, my wife said, we went out for meal on Saturday Yeah, what do we have? Said mushrooms. Were they tasty? And she looked at this again and I thought, well, they're not doing a lot for, for the greengrocer if these are the best you can manage. Just a few too many. Again, the lighting is even on all of the frame. So I'm trying to pick something out that's different for my eye to settle on. We've got two which we get the gills, the underneath, very, very clearly. One above, a third one, a tiny little triangle. Not quite sufficiently proud of the remainder of the image to grab my attention, but 15 marks.
Ken McGrath.
Beautiful texture on the petals. The other side of the petals is gorgeous. And I think the photographer has done extremely well. I love the tiny little rim light on the stalk. But on this one, I feel as though the snowdrop is hiding more than the photographer's allowing me to see. I just want to see that a little bit more. I think it's beautifully arranged as far as the lighting is concerned, as far as the backdrop is concerned. It just feels me wanting a little bit more. 16 marks.
Christine Armstrong.
Some of the titles are nice words of silly titles. I don't know if you noticed. B at beautiful flower. Never mind, right. I did notice the title, by the way, that's all I'm saying. On some of the earlier shots, I said I wanted to see a little bit more of the flower. I think on this one, the photographer is satisfying me on that without any question. The bee is working hard, the proboscis is delving amongst the all the possible nectar sources that exist. The depth of field is very, very shallow, so that as we go halfway along the stems and sepals, and we've softened very considerably. And I would just like to see a little bit more depth of field on this one. 17 marks.
Andy Foreman.
I know that my missus would enjoy being in, but there is literally so much to look at. I'm not sure what to look at. Right in the foreground, we've got out of focus, so that I've got to pass by. I'm more or less drawn to this little oasis of green in the middle of the image. Everything else is just blurred into being not important. And I think when you have a title of buttercups, I would like to see one or two of them a little bit sharp. 13 marks. That one will hold back, please. It's struggling hard, isn't it? In a very sandy environment, salty environment. I think the angle of lighting over the photographer's right shoulder is working well because we've got a depth presented to us by the length of the shadow. That works well. I don't think there's anything on the background that interferes with my view of the samphire, and we will go for 16 marks.
Carolyn Phillips.
We've got the low level, so this is the sensible nature photographer, you look for trees that have fungus growing above head height. That's the secret. You don't need to then worry about bending down. On this one, it works quite well. I enjoy following the trunk as the specimens reach up themselves to the skies. The dapple lighting in the background, the highlights, just a little bit distracting. I think you've got to do some careful toning down of the highlights, certainly on this left-hand side of the trunk, so that we enjoy looking at the specimens. 14 marks. Pleasing in the way that we captured it. Quite happy that the depth of field, the aperture that we've set on the camera, gives me now quite a decent indication as to the location, the area, the environment that this flower is to be found. And that works, I think, extremely well. Again, be very, very conscious of edges, because on this left-hand edge, about a quarter of the way up, you've got one irritating highlight coming in with that leaf. Very easy to take that off as a trim without any problem. And I think that would have helped. The flower itself is not designed for photographers, because it's a little bit difficult trying to determine what the shape of the flower is. But I think overall, I think that's been extremely well done, 16 marks.
Vince oh, Mandy Foreman.
Now somebody got underneath the foxglove, then I can see up into the middle of it. Yay! So very happy. I love the viewpoint. That gives me a lot more interest to look at than some of the earlier ones. Again, we've got this super rim lighting on the leaves and stem that works very, very well. I think that the image as it's presented is a tiny little bit over bright. I would have liked to have toned it down just a little bit. The white out of focus background, certainly in the top left, does want to be vignetted, does want to be toned down, so that I look at the rim light, I want to be the brightest white on the flower, on the image. And I think we need to do some toning down. Bit of work on that one, 17 marks.
Vince Sprackling.
Where are the fairies? You've got to have fairies when you've got magic ones like that, haven't you? I think you've done quite well getting a little colony in the open air rather than, as they frequently are, somewhat shrouded with overhang, very dark overhang. I'm quite happy with the photograph of the fire garret, even though the gills we're going to be struggling with. But there is sufficient depth of field from the bottom edge of the frame through to the third specimen on this left-hand side. I'm not certain that the two silver birches on the right-hand side have a great deal. One we could happily trim off. The second one is getting a little bit close to the edge of the, the same vertical line as the mushrooms, as the heads. So I think that the silver birch just needs to be toned down a little bit, and certainly to tone down or trim off the little piece of sky that appears in this towards this top right hand edge. I want nothing but the fire garret to capture attention. And I think that has got a very strong chance of doing so. 18 marks.
Mike Atkinson,
Robbie Griffin.
What the hell?
the hells.
All right, yeah, oh,
Yeah, mind
yeah,
You can,
to the end.
no, you can have the,
No, I can't hold them to the end of the night.
No.
you'll know, okay, fine. Right. Rhododendrons was a surprise because I said on quite a lot of the others that there were some very light, airy, creative images within the flowers. And this one differs. It's quite heavy. It's a statement. But the one thing that I do like about this that I think the photographer has done extremely carefully is vignetted the edges. So all the edges of the picture is slightly darker than the center. So you are, as a viewer, forced to look at the center. And I think that is photographic skill very well done. And that one was 18 marks. The crocus was a surprise because it was this is what I call a textbook photograph. It identifies the heads of the crocus extremely well. It gives an indication, perhaps if you look at the leaves that surround it, as to the time of the year that the crocus is likely to be found. So that works well. I think that the flash or the direct sunlight was actually put some highlights on the petals. Those highlights are stronger than highlights anywhere else on the image. So again, that brings our attention to the central group. And crocus gets 18 marks.
Steve Weatherly,
I find this to delight. My missus says I have no soul. But the bit of me that should have a soul is very well taken with this one. I find that the walking stick handle of the stem takes me in towards the four flowers. Everything is separated from background, and that separation is helped with post-processing quite a bit, because if we look at the lowest blue, there is a little bit of an ordeal immediately below it, where the cloning and the separation are quite full. Tiny little, I will use it once only. There's a tiny little straight edge there, which I think suggests or indicates the amount of work that's been done. But tonight, that is getting 20 marks.
Mike Atkinson,
Let's go. Plenty of information, plenty of interest. Photographically, it satisfies me. As a nature lover, it satisfies me because of the amount of life that there is. Fungus always works on dead wood, but fungus is life, and all the webs suggest that there is life being given to other creatures. 18 marks.
Peter Kay,
Very carefully done. There is sufficient sharpness in the moss at the base of the photograph. That the whole isn't just a total blur. We're having one or two specimens that are a little bit too close to the camera, so just outside the depth of field. But the fungus itself has been very carefully photographed. We've got texture on the stalk, which is quite difficult to achieve. We've got an underside that gives a clue. We've got some beautiful texture on the outside. It separates from the background very well, 19 marks.
Paul Calvert,
This is a change, isn't it? It's, the buttercups are there as almost as an aside. They're part of the scene where we are looking at the lighthouse. But the flowers in the foreground are pleasantly sharp and easily identified. I like the feel of it. I think that when you have your little friend do his little magic touch with holding the stems to get those two to cross over, I don't know, but if you'd seen it, I'm sure you would have accepted that the crossover works, and that is 18 marks.
Carol Weatherly,
Right. These I'll have to be relatively quick, otherwise you'll be waiting for McDonald's to walk into the morning for your breakfast. Woodland group. I love the gelatinous feel of this. Very strange, but certainly very, you know, gluey. So I think that has worked quite well. Background pleasantly softened out of focus, concentrates attention on the foreground and on the clump, and we'll start with 15 marks.
Peter Kay,
Oxide daisy, I think very well chosen by the photographer because the tones within the flower and within the stem are different to the tones within the background. So that works well. We've also got the grain of the wood more or less horizontal. We've got a very pleasing rate coming from this bottom left-hand corner. I think that works quite well for 17 marks.
Alison Townley,
This one I'm struggling with. It seems as though the ferns are trying desperately to come out of the cocoons to come into real life. But I'm not certain what to look at. We've got several of the new growth that are competing for attention. They're all similarly coloured, they're all similarly toned, and it leaves me somewhat confused. So I'm sorry, 13 marks. Water lily gives us, I think, another opportunity to use a little bit of photographic skill or photographic awareness by using the reflection as part of our composition. The flower stands out well against the water background and also against the leaf. And no problems with it, 16 marks.
Steve Weatherly,
I'm not sure of the meaning of the title, but the photograph itself, I'm not sure what it conveys to me, quite honestly. When I started off, I thought it was excuse me, a giant creepy crawly coming towards. That didn't work. There is so many conflicting lines and patterns within the background. I struggle hard on this one. I'm pleased that you've put the centre of the radiating lines away from centre of the image. But doesn't work too well, and the interruption in this bottom left-hand corner just interferes a bit too much. 14 marks. The new growth to the right of the main stem, well in focus. Even though the lighting is the same on the growth on the left-hand side, the depth of field doesn't record it sharp. Even though there seems to be very little difference in the plane away from camera. So the out of focus at the back just grabs a little bit too much. Sorry, 13 marks. I think it's often quite difficult trying to determine the title on some of these to say that it is being explanatory rather than being textbook images. I think this works pleasantly well. It's a crying shame that the bud on the left is more or less in front of the out of focus one immediately behind it. I would have loved to have pulled that one to one side a little bit and just helped your composition of three. And I think this is where you have the difficulty of trying to envisage what a black and white picture would look like when you're viewing it in colour. I think it was difficult to do. And the emerging fern gets 13 marks. Sorry, that's beginning middle. I'm sorry, I'm well off 15. My apologies.
Carol Weatherly,
No, sorry, no,
No,
That's the wrong one,
I'll
isn't
mess
it?
you up.
that's 13,
I'll
that's
mess you up.
13.
that's 13.
That's 13. Yeah.
Hmm?
Go on to the next one. That one had 15.
Yeah, sorry.
Sorry, I'm new at this.
So am I. So again, you've managed to separate the main interest from background. Gives a little bit of an inference that it may be in a forest. It seems to like contrast a little bit on this foreground area that you've chosen. I think it just needs a little bit of contrast lift. And I think that lift would perhaps have been eased for yourself by looking at some of those colour filters on, as we used to have on the old black and white films. 15 marks, nevertheless.
Billy Barman,
Everyone hold back, please. And again. Garlic flower, separated from background quite well, looking directly on the little spray, and again, the blue closest to the camera is outside that critical depth of field, because the depth of field and the sharpness works of the ghost rather than on that. So didn't quite make it, and 15 marks.
Billy Barman,
it shows up, I think, when you start doing the black and white photographs, how many areas of highlights there are in any one scene. And I think this one, there are so many pieces and little interference of highlights across the whole of the image. It makes the view of the emerging ferns difficult to read properly. So on this one, 14 marks. I'm sorry, you took the photograph. What were you looking at? What emotions did you have when you were taking the photograph? What message are you trying to convey to me? What do you want me to look at? Because on my own, I'm struggling. I don't know. There are so many items within this, similar tone to each other. I need an instruction book to help me through to what to look at, and 14 marks. Really turning to I'm telling you. But again, I think the lighting that you managed to get on this one is very good. You've managed to take away as much of the surround as you could sensibly take away without putting in too much to the colony. I applaud your lower level so that we can look up at the phone. And that worked, I thought, very well for 16.
Mike Atkinson.
Shine a light. Yes, they're coming through a little bit. The focus on the three heads are tiny little bit soft, because again, if we look carefully, which it just shows that I have looked at these, that is far sharper than any of the heads. And that's a shame, because I think the lighting that you've managed to get on them was pretty good. And so 15 marks.
Andy Foreman.
Please. Easels. This I find just a little bit too cluttered. I think we don't need quite as much base as you've elected to leave on this one. I quite enjoy climbing up the stems and looking at, which one's winning, which one's getting the most light that it can. The cloudscape, good idea. That gets rid of another series of problems with high light and low light areas. That worked quite pleasantly, 16 marks.
Carolyn Phillips.
Oh, it's pointed the petals just a little bit compared to the one in the earlier competition. We can now begin to see just a little bit inside. That worked quite well, although it doesn't hold attention for a particularly long time. But I thought that was quite well exposed in 15 marks.
Paul Calvert.
Two members of the family that are trying to push their way into the photograph behind this one is just a little bit too intrusive. I would love to see a little bit more separation that we have managed to do so, either by changing your viewpoint slightly or by opening your aperture up a little bit more to soften that background. Snowdrops gets 14 marks. I'm not sure what I'm looking at. I'm honestly not certain. It might be weathered tree, it might be rock. um, It might be that the local painter and decorator has been emptying his paintbrushes after a job. I don't know. I need something to identify a little bit what it is that I'm looking at. At the moment, I'm struggling for it. Some of the very, very heavy shadows at the bottom right-hand corner don't help in my identifying the location. 13 marks. I've got to, I'm convinced. I applaud your decision for the diagonal. That works well. Whether the background is straight out of focus as it is, I'm not overly worried. What does concern me is those little white specks, and I'm not certain whether those are seeds that are being, or dust mites that are being scattered around, whether it's a bit of carelessness on your part in the cleanliness of equipment. Like I think, had that been mine, go back 30 years, I've been spending like 4 nights with a potting brush trying to get rid of the damn things. That remains with me, unfortunately, at this juncture. So 14 marks. All back, please. I think the photographers tried to make a pleasing photograph. I accept the use of what would appear to be almost a white filter, a white layer on this to soften everything up a little bit. I think it softened it off a little bit too much. I'm happy to soften off the background. I would have preferred that the foreground foxglove was a little bit sharper in detail. 15 marks.
Ruth Lockery.
Again, whenever I've seen photographs of dandelion tops, they've always looked so very light and airy because they're waiting for the wind to take the seeds away to new places. And this one looks rather heavy. It looks as though, in spite of the winds that there might have been, this one is holding tight to its last few seed heads. So it's a little bit more contrasting than I'm used to seeing. But because of that, I've got to look at it a couple of times and say, yeah, everything is pleasantly sharp all the way around, and even going towards the centre. It begins to fall off a little bit towards the back end, but that's quite pleasant. 15 marks.
Down Stott.
Water marigold. 3 items on the image. They don't seem particularly connected, and I think there should be a little bit more connection. Bear in mind again, when you're looking through the camera viewpoint, you're influenced by the colours that you see. You've taken that away from me, and I therefore struggle a little bit. Decent side lighting on the flower head, which was, I think, very deliberately done. But as we are at 14 marks. It looks even. It really does. It reminded me, and it's nothing like what there was it Quatermass experiment? You know, this is more horrific than any of the Doctor Who stuff. It has that evil look about it, which I think has been very well captured. The specimen stands out well against background. The floor is sufficiently short to give a clue and 16 marks.
Kirsty Railton,
Darken down. Dark, yes, but I think back initially to that very first image that came up, that gelatinous look that they have, which is missing off these, in spite of the fact that the fungi on the left-hand side seems to have literally a lake of water in the bottom. And I think that should have come across much more clearly. The shadows are blocking up quite a bit. And again, I think it's something that we have to perhaps look at the filters, but most definitely on this one, to look at the levels to make sure that we printed to best advantage. 14 marks. This is hairstyle, but black one, right. Again, the overlapping shapes make it difficult for me to really identify where you would want me to go. The 2 or 3 heads on the left-hand side of the growth, I can relate to those, but when I come on to the main area on the right-hand side, the overlapping of one on top of another makes it very, very difficult for me to form a pattern which holds my attention. So 13 marks. Alternatively called last year's fashion. It's gone out of popularity in it. It's beginning to look very, very tired. Beginning to break up, the head is beginning to break. I think quite well illuminated, and I think that helps it stand out well against the stand of trees in the background. I think that works quite cleverly with 15 marks.
Mike Atkinson,
First is overawed by the specular findings of the background. I find it very, very difficult to do without being affected by those. And I'm sorry, 13 marks. Bracket has brought back the contrast, which I think has been perhaps lacking on 1 or 2 of the earlier images. Plenty of detail on the bark of the tree on the trunk. Gives a good indication as to its location, as to even which tree, but which tree it grows on. So that works, I think, quite reasonably well. 15 marks.
Alison Townley,
You've got good separation of the main focus from background. I'm sorely tempted, and again, it is something that's very, very difficult to do. Certainly, if you are shooting without a tripod, but seeing 1 or 2 of the little annoyances creeping in, I think you need to be aware that you are able to remove them or soften them within the printing process. But I think that worked quite very well. 16 marks.
Jane Patel,
Out on a limb, rather contrasty. Again, we can see the looks like silver birch on which this thing is growing. I'm not too certain whether I'm particularly comfortable with those shadows on the right hand edge. I think it'd be quite difficult to crop them off totally, but I think we can pretend that the bigger tree trunk is half as wide again as it is, and just clone in another little bit of it to give you an edge where you can trim off. It's beginning to lose a little bit of detail in the highlight immediately above the fungus, and that's beginning to become bleached white. So 14 marks. That's a new one, is that? Totally new specimen, is that? Again, just to show that I did look and read them. Take care of the edges. There's a face at the top towards the right hand edge with two eyes and a mirroring mouth and a fag stuck out the side. It doesn't help. I think we can certainly get rid of the two eyes. We could then darken down a little bit, tone down a little bit to effect, so that I want the highlights in the flower to dominate everywhere else. But I think that was quite a reasonable attempt. So just a little bit of care needed, but 17 marks.
Into sprackling.
Single fungus. It gives the impression when I first look at this that it's tiny, tiny, tiny. And if that is a truthful rendition of it, then I think you've been very successful. I'm not too keen on having the immediate foreground as blurred as it is on this shot. I find it just a little bit unnerving that I've got to go through all this sort of soft mush to get to the interest. So I think it just needs a little bit of care. I think the lighting of it, you've done extremely well, and our single one gets 15 marks.
Colin Yates.
That will hold back, please. Left one. Probably coincidence. Yeah, so the evil look of this crawly, creepy thingy, I think has been well displayed within the title. I don't think quite as successful as the ones in colour, because I don't know whether it's a dinosaur or whatever it is at the back. But this one just grabs my attention and takes my attention away a little bit from the foreground ones, because I think a slightly lower viewpoint would have hidden those behind this, put them on the skyline, and I think that would have been a lovely, strong composition. But quite nicely in 15 marks.
Kirsty Railton.
Right. The areas that are of no interest to the photographer pleasantly softened out of focus. They are not of a shape that particularly interferes with the main subject. 18 marks.
Peter Kay.
Teasel, I think, was a good balance, that you've managed to get separation from that. We've got a little bit of help in the background with one or two of these paler radiating lines coming from behind the teasel head, which helps us to look, I think, much more interesting at the teasel. And in spite of the very pale areas, it would appear still to be full of detail. So 19 marks.
Ken McGrath.
I want to hold it again.
Just go over it.
Never mind. Black and white blusher. Again, we've managed to get a separation of subject from background. I'm quite happy with that. Depth of field then makes me start looking partway down the stem of this little secondary growth, which is now a lot softer than I believe it should be. I think it was well done to start off with. Little bit of attention to detail will help enormously. But that one, 18 marks.
Paul Calvert,
Bit different. I've complained about the snowdrops all sort of hiding their inner beings from everybody. And on this one, the photographer has gone straight into the center of the flower. This works extremely well. And in spite of it being a high key photograph, it would appear to have retained detail throughout. Very envious, 19 marks.
Steve Weatherly,
You don't like it as much as I do. Think the photographer has made use of monochrome to advantage. We've chosen a viewpoint, we've left very little really as a base, but sufficient to satisfy me. Because the base has got some bright areas which is managed to conceal to a large extent. The background is just multi-tone. It could be sky, it could be other parts of the forest. Doesn't matter. There is it is not a monotone, it's not monotonous. So that works well. The slightly lower viewpoint raises the stature of the snowdrops. Lovely and short, 20 marks.
Christine Armstrong,
Yeah, not program edition, but the alert object, I think. Extremely well. But also, I think it also suggests that the photographer hadn't thought about what he was doing. My sense of colour was something that Mother Nature puts in everything. What colour does she next?